Elijah Carter's first day at Ashfield High began with silence, tight, uneasy silence. Not the kind that whispers welcome, but the kind that presses on your chest like a warning. He walked through the front gates with a backpack older than most freshmen, his second-hand sneakers dragging dust from the pavement. He noticed the eyes. Not curious, judging. Measuring. Dismissing. By third period, the comments started. "You in the wrong building, boy? Yo, check out Obama. Bet he thinks he's smarter than us." He ignored them, just like his mother taught him. Keep your head down. Focus. Prove them wrong by being better. Always better. But fourth period gym class didn't let him stay invisible. Coach Danner handed him a crumpled uniform from a dusty box and barked at him to change fast. The locker room was a cage. No windows. Just metal and sweat. Elijah turned toward a corner locker. Before he could pull his shirt over his head, someone shoved him hard into the bench. Laughter. 3 of them. White, bigger, louder. Jace, Tyler, and Mitch. Football players. "Welcome party," they said. They shoved him again. He fell, shirt half on, half off. One grabbed his arm and twisted it. "What's wrong, scared?" They slapped his head like it was a game. "Say something," Mitch dared. "What, you mute?" Elijah stared at them. Not with fear. With calculation. But they saw what they wanted to see. Tyler spat on his shoes. "Go back where you came from." A punch flew. Elijah didn't know whose. His lip split. The locker door behind him rattled. Coach Danner walked in, saw the scene, and didn't ask a single question. Just yelled, "Carter!" outside. Now. In the office, Principal Burkhart reviewed the incident report. 2 lines. 1 name. Elijah Carter, aggressor. Suspended 3 days. No calls to parents. No questions asked. Just a cold signature and a warning. "We don't tolerate violence." Outside the office, Elijah waited for the late bus. Alone. His head throbbed. His lip bled. No one stopped. When he got home, his mother looked at him like he was breaking. "This again?" she asked softly. "Different faces. Same story," he said. "But they don't know who I am." That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He sat with a flashlight under the covers, flipping through the beat-up copy of Landmark Legal Battles of the 20th Century he'd found at the library. Inside was a section on Brown versus Board of Education. Words like due process, equal protection, precedent. Something clicked. If they won then, why not now? He began documenting everything. The hallway taunts. The suspicious stares. The classroom microaggressions. The way teachers called on everyone but him. The side eyes when he asked questions. The time his essay was graded down for being too militant. At night, he transcribed it all. Date, time, names. He'd build a record the way lawyers do. Not a kid complaining. A case being prepared. He borrowed his uncle's old laptop. Slow but good enough. He learned how to file Freedom of Information requests. How to request security footage. How to submit complaints, even if they were ignored. Every time someone pushed, he took note. But the weight grew heavier. School wasn't just hard, it was hostile. Even the teachers didn't hide it anymore. One sub said, "If you people spent more time studying instead of causing trouble." The room fell quiet. Elijah raised his hand. "What people?" The sub's eyes narrowed. "You know what I mean." He didn't answer. He wrote it down, word for word. At lunch, he sat alone. By choice. Every attempt to speak to others turned cold quick. People looked past him, like he wasn't even there. One teacher whispered to another, "That boy's got a chip on his shoulder." He didn't. He had a plan. It was at the community center that he met the man who changed everything. Harold Beckett sat in the corner during one of the youth debate club meetings. A worn-out fedora tilted forward. He listened, never spoke. But Elijah noticed him every time. One evening, Elijah stayed behind to clean up and found Harold flipping through his binder of legal note. "You wrote all this?" Harold asked. Elijah nodded. "You can't just tell them. You have to prove it. Every word. Every moment. You planning to sue the school district? Harold asked. Elijah blinked. Maybe. Harold smiled without showing teeth. Not a maybe. Either you do or you let them win. That night, Harold told him who he used to be, civil rights attorney, landmark case in the 90s, retired after a bitter disbarment case he'd beaten on appeal but couldn't outlive in reputation. Why are you here? Elijah asked. Looking for someone who still believes in justice, Harold replied. Found you. Elijah's next question came without hesitation. Will you help me? Harold paused. I won't speak for you. But I'll teach you how to speak so loudly the law has no choice but to listen. It wasn't a partnership. It was an apprenticeship. Elijah learned how to write brief, how to cite precedents, how to challenge bias without screaming, how to win in silence. 3 weeks later, he filed suit against Ashfield School District. Civil rights violation. Failure to protect. Racial discrimination. He used his name. No initials. No pseudonym. The news barely noticed. The school laughed it off. But Elijah didn't file for attention. He filed because someone had to. And because no one expected a 16-year-old black boy to know how to weaponize the Constitution. He printed the complaint himself, walked into the clerk's office, stood in front of the desk. I'm filing a pro-se federal suit, he said. The clerk raised an eyebrow. You're the plaintiff? Yes. She took the papers, stamped them. Well then, Mr. Carter, she said. We'll see where this goes. He already knew. Straight to the truth. The complaint had been filed. The ink on the lawsuit was barely dry when the blowback started. Not from the school board first, but from his peers. The whispers turned to mutters, then to full-on threats. You think suing us makes you better? One student growled at his locker. He's trying to get attention, another scoffed in the hallway. That week, someone keyed the word liar into his mother's car. The vice principal called it unfortunate mischief. The local paper ran a 2-paragraph piece with no quote from Elijah, but a generous statement from the school's attorney calling the lawsuit frivolous and unfounded. But Elijah kept building. Every evening, he studied court documents, watched trial footage, and dissected old civil rights litigation. The school didn't expect him to keep going. They expected the pressure to crush him. But he didn't retreat. He became sharper. He started submitting public record requests, teacher complaint logs, security camera footage, school emails. Most were denied, but a few slipped through. Enough to show a pattern. Enough to show the rot wasn't new. Harold guided him but never led. I won't fight your battle. I'll show you how not to lose it. Elijah spent hours drafting motions. Every word mattered. Every citation had to be perfect. His home became a war room of notebooks, flash drives, casebooks, and highlighters. One night, Harold handed him an old file box. Inside were court transcripts from a case nearly 30 years ago. A school in Alabama, same tactics, different era. This is how they hide it, Harold said. Repeat patterns. Mask intent. Bury it under bureaucracy. Inside one transcript was a phrase that stuck with Elijah. The law does not reward silence. He decided to speak louder. He created a secure online archive, uploading everything he documented. Date, photos, transcripts of meetings. It wasn't just about his story, it was a pattern of abuse. Dozens of unnamed students echoed in the data. Suspensions, ignored complaints, unequal discipline. He started finding others. Quiet conversations in hallways. Anonymous tips on school forums. Former students reached out through burner accounts. That happened to me too, they said. One girl had been expelled for insubordination after recording a teacher's slur. Another boy dropped out after being falsely accused of theft. None had filed complaints. They didn't believe the system worked. Elijah did. But not the system as it was. The one he was reshaping. At a town hall meeting, he signed up for the public comments section. He had 2 minutes to speak. He didn't waste a second. He listed data, read excerpts from his filed complaint, and ended with one line. If adults won't protect us, maybe it's time the children hold them accountable. The room went silent. Then chaos. The superintendent dismissed him. A board member called it performative activism. But the video went viral within a day. The media tried to get his face. He declined every interview. No camera angles. Just transcripts, facts, legal document. This isn't about me, he told Harold. It's about what they've built, and what we're about to tear down. Still, the pressure grew. His mother lost clients at her salon. Rumors swirled that she was raising a radical. The school counselor offered him a mental health break. I'm not having a breakdown, Elijah replied. I'm making history. One night, a brick crashed through their window with a note, "Drop the case." He didn't flinch. He added it to his evidence folder. But even the strongest minds need rest. Elijah began losing sleep. He missed meals, sometimes forgetting if it was morning or night. Harold noticed. You can't fight if you break, Harold warned. I'm not broken, Elijah said. I'm boiling. Harold nodded. Good. Now aim it. Then came the email. A forwarded message from a nervous teacher, unsigned, unverified, but explosive. It was a thread between administrators discussing problem students, specifically referring to high-risk minorities. His name was on it, highlighted. Elijah read it 10 times. It wasn't just cruel. It was systemic. Is this real? He asked. Doesn't matter, Harold said. If it exists, they'll deny it. But now they know you have it. That's power. The case moved slowly. Motions to dismiss were filed by the school district. They claimed lack of merit, lack of evidence, lack of standing. But Elijah knew how to write rebuttals. He submitted one titled simply, Lack of Silence. It cited 4 Supreme Court cases, 2 circuit precedents, and 43 instances of misconduct documented over 2 years. The judge denied the motion. The school board panicked. At school, attitudes shifted. Teachers stopped looking him in the eye. One administrator resigned quietly. Another took a sudden leave of absence. Bullies avoided him altogether now, not from respect but from fear. He wasn't a student anymore. He was a threat, a force. He was reshaping the landscape around him without lifting a finger in rage. At a community meeting, a mother of a biracial student spoke out. Because of Elijah, my son goes to school without fear. Another man stood. I taught at Ashfield. I saw what they did. I left. I regret staying silent. The voices were multiplying. The lawsuit wasn't about one boy anymore. It had become a mirror for a town that didn't like what it saw. Elijah stayed focused. It's not about exposure, he told Harold. It's about justice. Harold corrected him. It's about both. Truth without consequence is just a diary. They prepared for trial. Depositions were scheduled. Elijah deposed 3 teachers himself. Calm, clinical, brutal. He asked one simple question again and again. Did you report it? They couldn't lie. They couldn't hide. The evidence was too tight. Every detail had a timestamp. Every claim had a record. Every denial had a counterpoint. And it all started with one student who refused to be erased. The court date loomed. The town braced for a storm. But Elijah didn't flinch. He stood straighter than ever. Because every insult, every bruise, every lie, it all built the platform he now stood on. Not as a victim. As the architect of his own vindication. The courthouse hallway smelled like polished wood and old air, but Elijah wasn't distracted. His focus was surgical. This was the first pretrial hearing. The school's legal team entered in pressed suits, 3 of them, led by a partner from a high-end firm hired by the district. Elijah stood alone, save for Harold behind him, quiet, arms folded, a silent shield. The defense tried to belittle him immediately. One lawyer leaned down and asked, "You sure you want to keep going, son? This isn't a school debate." Elijah looked him straight in the eye. You sure you're prepared to lose to a child? That shut the man up. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Elijah introduced himself, pro se calm, professional, exact. No theatrics. Just law. The court listened. They had no choice, he earned it. The defense opened with a motion to dismiss all remaining claims. Claimed insufficient evidence. Called the entire case a mischaracterization of disciplinary action. Elijah responded with pure fire, in the form of logic, citations, and legal language the court didn't expect from a teenager. He quoted the Equal Protection Clause. He dissected case law from the Sixth Circuit. He used the school's own handbook to prove disparity in how rules were enforced. When the judge asked if he had anything further, Elijah responded, "Just the truth, Your Honor." And 327 pages of it. The motion to dismiss was denied in full. The courtroom buzzed. The school lawyers exchanged looks. Harold smiled for the first time in months. Outside, reporters waited, but Elijah walked past them. No statements. No show. The work wasn't finished. He spent the next month taking depositions, submitting interrogatories, filing for discovery extensions. He requested redacted personnel files, uncovered complaints the district thought were buried. One in particular stood out, a letter from a former teacher describing systemic racism, retaliation, and a pattern of silencing dissent. It had been sealed. Elijah got it unsealed. He added it to Exhibit J. People started calling him a genius. He ignored it. Intelligence wasn't the engine. It was anger, refined through law, driven by the need for justice not just for himself, but for every kid who got labeled trouble for existing in brown skin. One day, an envelope arrived from the ACLU. Inside was a letter of recognition and an offer to co-counsel. Elijah declined respectfully. "I appreciate the support, but I have to see this through on my own." The media caught wind again. Teen legal prodigy challenges school racism. National headlines. Commentators debated whether the school was guilty of racial bias or just bad optics. Elijah didn't care about optics. He cared about the law. Then, an anonymous source leaked internal emails from the school district's legal advisors. One line stood out. "Settle before the kid gets us in front of a jury." The board panicked. They offered a settlement. A large one. Money. A public statement. No admission of guilt. Confidentiality clause. Elijah read every line. Then he stood up and walked out. He didn't want hush money. He wanted accountability. A week later, his motion to admit pattern-based evidence was approved. He could now show that the district didn't just fail him, they failed dozens. Systematically. Repeatedly. The school's lawyers tried to regroup, but cracks were showing. Staff began resigning. A whistleblower went public. Elijah received a letter from a boy he'd never met. 9th grade. Quiet. Mixed race. Said he thought about dropping out. "But I saw your case. I stayed." Another email came. A parent. "You're fighting for kids who can't even spell litigation. Don't stop." Then came the community shift. Black and brown families who had stopped attending school board meetings returned. Spoke up. Showed support. Students staged walkouts, not in protest but in solidarity. Even teachers started coming forward. Quiet at first, then louder. One testified at a deposition, "I was told not to report what I saw. I wish I hadn't stayed silent." The court date approached. National networks sent crews. Elijah remained silent. Always behind the scenes, always controlled. Harold warned him, "The day of trial, they'll play dirty. They'll try to rattle you. Don't let them drag you into emotion." "I'm not emotional," Elijah said. "I'm ready." The night before court, he reviewed his entire case. Every exhibit, every testimony, every timeline. He rehearsed his opening statement like it was a war speech, not to stir the crowd, but to cut through the noise. He thought of his mother. Still working late, still brushing off threats, still telling him he was doing the right thing. He thought of the boy in the locker room, the punch, the spit, the word aggressor on the suspension slip. And he thought of what Harold had told him on day one. Don't just expose injustice, dismantle it. That night, Elijah didn't dream. He didn't need to. Tomorrow, the court would hear what schools had refused to, that dignity is not given by institutions. It is seized by the determined. And Elijah Carter was nothing if not determined. The courtroom was packed. Parents, students, journalists, even former teachers filled the benches. Cameras were barred from the room, but the tension was national. The district had 5 lawyers. Elijah had himself and Harold behind him, hands clasped, silent. The judge gave a warning: decorum must be maintained. No outbursts, no interruptions. The bailiff stood ready. Elijah rose. His voice was steady, low, but deliberate. My name is Elijah Carter, and today I'm not here as a victim. I'm here as a citizen invoking the rights promised by the Constitution, rights denied by the very system meant to protect me. No flair. No tears. Just truth. He told the jury how he'd been labeled violent for defending himself, punished harsher than his white classmates, and ignored when he sought help. He explained the data, the documents, the emails, the bias so obvious it didn't require interpretation, just attention. The defense countered with professionalism, polished statements, graphs of declining suspensions, and claims of misunderstandings. They referred to Elijah's experience as isolated and unfortunate. They blamed inexperience among staff. They expressed concern for the school's reputation. But Elijah dismantled each point. He introduced comparative discipline records, showing clear racial disparities. He showed policies enforced inconsistently. He cross-examined administrators himself. Calm. Surgical. Unforgiving. Were you aware of prior complaints of racial harassment? I don't recall. Do you deny receiving emails from parents about unequal punishment? I'd need to see the emails. Elijah provided them. Signed. Dated. Ignored. Every answer that evaded truth only strengthened his case. The jury could see it. He called students as witnesses. A Latina sophomore testified how she was suspended for filming a white student using slurs, while the student received a warning. A black junior told the jury how he was searched weekly based on suspicion. Their testimonies weren't dramatic. They were consistent. Then Elijah called a teacher who had resigned after her warnings were ignored. I was told I was being too sensitive about race, she said. They told me to focus on the curriculum. She looked directly at the jury. That boy, she said, pointing to Elijah, did more for justice than anyone on that campus. The defense tried to shift blame. They questioned Elijah's motivations, accused him of enjoying the spotlight. They referenced his refusal to settle. They implied he had been manipulated by outside forces. Elijah responded during redirect. I didn't do this to be seen. I did this so no one else would be erased. He rested his case. The judge allowed a recess before closing argument. Whispers filled the room. The jury watched Elijah, but he kept his eyes on the ground, focused. Harold handed him a bottle of water and said nothing. No encouragement, no advice, just presence. When they returned, Elijah gave his final statement. He spoke not of revenge, but of responsibility. We ask children to follow rules adults won't. We preach equality and then punish difference. We cannot teach fairness when we reward silence. He paused, looked at each juror. This case isn't about one school. It's about a pattern, a culture, a silence we're taught to accept. But I refused. And now, you get to decide whether I was wrong to speak. He sat down. The defense spoke last. They pleaded for understanding, cited budgetary constraints, claimed they were doing their best. But the air had changed. The courtroom didn't believe them anymore. Deliberation took a day. The jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Guilty of discrimination, violation of civil rights, and institutional negligence. The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Elijah didn't smile. He closed his notebook and stood. Harold nodded once, proud but silent. The judge addressed the court directly. What this young man has done should be studied in law schools. Justice has been served, not through anger, but through brilliance. The district was ordered to pay damages, implement bias training, revise its discipline policies, and submit to federal oversight for 5 years. That night, Elijah walked home under a sky full of stars. No cheers, no victory parade. Just peace. The kind you earn. He wasn't just the boy who sued his school anymore. He was the reason it had to change. The ruling sent shockwaves through the country. Civil rights groups hailed it as a landmark decision. Legal analysts dissected every move Elijah made, astonished at how a high school student dismantled an entire legal defense crafted by seasoned professionals. But Elijah didn't care for the noise. He turned down every interview request. No talk shows, no podcast tours. His message had already been delivered where it mattered most. The courtroom. Back at school, the atmosphere had shifted. Teachers no longer looked through him. Students no longer mocked him. Even the ones who once laughed when he was shoved in the hallway now nodded silently when he passed. Not out of guilt, out of recognition. The faculty underwent training sessions, policies were rewritten, and a new principal replaced the one who'd resigned 2 days after the verdict. Elijah returned to class with no fanfare. He took his seat near the window and pulled out a textbook. When the teacher began the lesson, he followed along like nothing had changed, but everything had. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a precedent. He didn't skip a beat in his studies. While the media tried to crown him a prodigy or a symbol, he kept his head down and prepared for the next phase. College applications, LSAT prep. He'd already decided. He wasn't done with the law. He was just getting started. Harold, meanwhile, reactivated his license full-time. For the first time in years, he had a purpose again. Inspired by Elijah, he took on pro bono civil rights cases, this time with fire in his gut. He'd been asked on panels, law school guest lectures, but he only ever brought up one case, Elijah's. Not because it was the most shocking, but because it proved something he'd stopped believing, that the law still had power when wielded with truth. A few months later, Elijah was invited to testify before a congressional committee on educational discrimination. He arrived in a modest suit, no entourage. The chairwoman asked if he had any prepared remarks. "I speak best from what I've lived," he said. He talked about systems that protect the abusers, not the abused. How policy without accountability is performance. How real change doesn't come from apologies, it comes from restructuring power. One representative asked him if he thought racism was really still a problem in schools. He looked the man in the eye. "Only if you consider statistics, facts, and hundreds of first-hand accounts a problem." Another tried to challenge his credentials. "You're not a lawyer. You're a kid. How can we trust your judgment over trained professionals?" Elijah responded, "Because I was the one bleeding while they filed reports about how I fell." The chamber went silent. The transcript later circulated through legal blogs, parenting forums, and education think tanks. Within 6 weeks, a bipartisan group introduced the Elijah Carter Student Protection Act, aimed at federal oversight of discrimination claims in public schools. Back home, his mother, who had endured anonymous threats and veiled warnings at work, now walked with her head higher. Community leaders reached out. Churches asked Elijah to speak. He declined most of them. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because he believed real work didn't happen in speeches. It happened in policy. He started mentoring other students, teaching them how to file FOIA requests, how to document interactions, how to navigate grievance procedures. He didn't tell them to sue. He told them to know their rights better than those trying to deny them. Local districts began to adopt reforms out of caution. No one wanted to be the next headline. But Elijah wasn't after fear. He wanted understanding. At the same time, some pushed back. There were school board members in other districts claiming he was a troublemaker, that he'd made things harder for teachers. Elijah never responded directly, but one post on his personal blog went viral. He wrote, "If your system is harder to manage after it's made more fair, maybe the problem wasn't fairness, it was your comfort with inequality." That post was shared by legal scholars, activists, and even celebrities. But again, Elijah didn't ride the wave. He stayed focused on the next battle, systemic immunity. With Harold's help, he filed a petition to challenge qualified immunity for school officials who suppress civil rights complaints. It didn't gain traction overnight, but it stirred debate in law journals. For the first time in decades, student rights were back in national discourse. The university that had rejected him before reopened his application. He declined. Instead, he accepted a scholarship at a historically black college. Not because it was easier, but because he wanted to grow in a place that didn't see his existence as a disruption. There, he planned to double major in pre-law and policy development. He didn't want to just change the rules, he wanted to write new ones. The kids who once picked on him? Some dropped out. Some transferred. A few even tried to apologize. Elijah accepted but never forgot. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting, it was choosing not to become the thing that tried to destroy you. By the end of his senior year, Elijah had been honored by multiple civil liberties groups. But the award he cherished most came from a local middle school that created an annual Elijah Carter Award for Justice and Leadership. He visited in secret, spoke to students quietly, told them to read, to ask questions, to never, ever believe they were powerless. Because if there was one thing his journey proved, it was that power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it walks in alone, with a binder of facts and a voice that won't shake. And when that voice is heard, it doesn't just change a verdict. It changes everything. Elijah's impact didn't end with the courtroom or congressional hearings. His case had cracked something deeper, an institutional silence that had persisted for generations. The ruling triggered a review of over 120 similar disciplinary cases across the country. Within months, lawsuits began surfacing from other students, many of whom had never believed justice was even possible until they saw what Elijah had done. A movement had ignited, not from slogans or marches, but from precedent and proof. He became a symbol reluctantly. Journalists referred to him as the kid who rewrote the rules, but he rejected the mythology. He was never trying to be a hero. He simply refused to accept that injustice was part of the curriculum. In every interview he eventually gave, he steered the narrative back to others, the voiceless students who came before him, the communities still fighting, the adults who chose silence when they should have chosen truth. Law schools added a case study bearing his name to their first-year curriculum. Professors debated his tactics and composure. Some admired his strategic restraint. Others were critical of his refusal to compromise. But no one denied the result. His case reached the Supreme Court in the form of a broader appeal prompted by the school district, which sought to overturn the ruling by challenging its applicability across state lines. The case became known as Carter v. Board of Education. Elijah wasn't the petitioner this time, but he filed an amicus brief himself, unpaid, unaffiliated. It was direct, elegant, and piercing. He argued that justice is not a matter of geography, and that a child's right to dignity shouldn't fluctuate depending on which zip code they're born into. The brief was cited 4 times during oral argument. The court upheld the lower court's decision in a 6-3 ruling. For the first time, federal precedent recognized student-based racial discrimination in disciplinary policy as a violation of constitutional equal protection standard. Districts were now required to audit their discipline metrics for bias, and failure to act would result in the loss of federal funding. The ripple was seismic. The Department of Education launched a task force to assist compliance effort. Legal clinics expanded outreach. School boards began to include community equity liaisons. Public awareness surged. Not because of political pressure, but because of legal obligation. Elijah kept working. He interned for civil rights organizations in the summer, but never joined full-time. He didn't want to be absorbed into the system too quickly. He believed his strength came from walking alongside it, not within it. He published essays under a pseudonym, pushing for deeper reforms in school resource officer programs and disciplinary hearings. Each piece gained traction, not because of his name, but because his arguments were airtight. Eventually, he co-founded a nonprofit, not for recognition but to institutionalize advocacy. It offered legal literacy workshops for high school students and parents, focusing on marginalized communities. No fees, no fanfare, just tools. The motto, "Know your rights, use your voice." Over time, schools changed. Not just because they had to, but because students were no longer willing to accept the old rules. Elijah had shown what was possible, and that was all many of them needed. It became common for students to challenge unfair suspensions, cite civil codes, and request due process in hearings. They weren't disrespectful, they were informed. And for the first time, that knowledge was feared more than their skin color. Despite the nationwide reform, backlash existed. Conservative groups accused Elijah of weaponizing race. Some even launched campaigns to reverse the new standard. But every attempt faltered under legal scrutiny. Courts now had a standard to follow, and that standard was Elijah's case. He knew backlash was part of the process. Real change never comes without resistance. He used it as fuel. For every attempt to roll back progress, he responded with data, case law, and organizing. Never emotion, just result. Eventually, he was asked to speak at his old high school's graduation. The invitation came from the new principal, a black woman hired during the district's reform period. Elijah accepted on one condition: there would be no grand introduction, no hero worship. He would speak only as a former student with something to say. When he stood before the graduating class, he didn't mention his court case. He didn't talk about the Supreme Court or the legislation. He simply said, "You have more power than you've been told. Don't wait for permission to use it." The auditorium stood in silence. No cheers, no applause. Just reflection. After the speech, a student approached him. Freshman. Glasses. Nervous. "I filed a complaint last month," the student said. "They didn't ignore it this time. I think it's because of what you did." Elijah shook the boy's hand. "No," he said. "It's because you spoke." Legacy for Elijah was never about being remembered. It was about ensuring others wouldn't be forgotten. He went on to graduate top of his class in college. Law school followed. He didn't choose a corporate firm. He didn't run for office. He became a public defender. To some, it was a step down, but to him, it was the front line. Because justice, real justice, wasn't just about landmark rulings. It was about showing up, every day, for the ones the system still overlooked. And that's what Elijah Carter did. Not because it was glamorous, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Years later, Elijah stood before a different kind of bench. This time, not as a defendant, not as a plaintiff, but as a federal judge. His nomination had been confirmed unanimously, something rare in a divided Senate. Not because of politics but because of clarity. His record was undeniable, his values unshaken. He had spent his entire career defending the very people most systems overlook. Now, he was entrusted with upholding the law for all. But titles didn't change Elijah. He refused to use a security escort unless required. He carried his own case files. He ate lunch with court staff. He was never interested in status, only service. The courtroom he presided over was unlike others. He insisted on plain language in proceedings. Defendants were spoken to, not at. Public defenders who worked his courtroom were given more prep time. Prosecutors who leaned on bias or theatrics were called out, on record, without hesitation. In one of his first high-profile cases, he ruled in favor of a single mother whose child had been expelled without due process. The district claimed they followed protocol. Elijah's written opinion said otherwise. It concluded, "Protocol is not protection when it is rooted in exclusion." That ruling was cited by judges in 4 states within a year. His chambers were filled not with awards, but with letters. Dozens, hundreds, from students, parents, teachers, even former bullies. Some anonymous, some not. Letters that spoke of changed hearts, second chances, and how one boy's refusal to stay silent had altered their view of justice forever. One letter stood out. It was from a retired janitor who had once worked at Elijah's old school. "Back then, I saw what they did to you. I said nothing. I was scared. I've never stopped regretting that. But now, every time I see your name in the news, I feel like maybe you forgave us. Maybe you gave us another chance to be better." Elijah didn't respond to every letter. He didn't need to. His work answered for him. Outside the courtroom, he quietly funded scholarships for students in underrepresented communities pursuing law, education, or social justice. He did it anonymously, but word spread. He mentored from afar, advised nonprofits on policy reform, and guest lectured at schools under the radar. The only public initiative he ever lent his name to was a national youth legal literacy program. It was called Know the Law, Change the World. It became a cornerstone in schools across the country. When asked once in an interview why he chose to remain so private despite his stature, Elijah answered, "Because justice isn't about me. It's about what comes after me. If all I do is inspire people to talk, I've failed. I want them to act, to write, to question, to push, to become the next version of what I needed when I was their age." Years into his judgeship, Elijah oversaw a case eerily similar to his own. A black high schooler suspended over vague, disruptive behavior, while the white students involved faced no consequences. The school's attorneys argued the student was combative. Elijah listened, reviewed the evidence, and ruled. He wrote, "This court finds not just bias, but pattern. And pattern, when ignored, becomes practice. And practice, when left unchecked, becomes policy. This stops now." His opinion didn't just reverse the suspension. It forced the school to retrain its staff, apologize publicly, and publish its revised policies. National headlines returned. Elijah ignored them. It wasn't about attention. It was about accountability. Meanwhile, he continued building something quieter but deeper, a bench of ments. Former defendants who had gone straight. Young lawyers who'd once faced discrimination themselves. Students who read his original case as kids and now passed the bar. He taught them not how to win, but how to endure. How to resist bitterness. How to build systems that wouldn't need people like him to fix them. Among his clerks was a young man named Malik, the same freshman who had filed that complaint years ago and thanked Elijah after graduation. Now a practicing attorney, Malik said he became a lawyer because someone showed him it was possible. "You didn't just argue your case," he told Elijah. "You lived it. And the rest of us, we followed." One evening, alone in his chambers, Elijah reread his old court brief from the original case, the one that started it all. The language was raw, but the spirit was clear. It wasn't a legal document. It was a declaration of self-worth, of resistance, of belief that the law could still serve those it often ignored. He smiled, closed the folder, and looked out the window at the city below. Not as a symbol, not as a savior, just as a man who had once been a boy everyone tried to silence. And he remembered that silence wasn't broken by noise. It was broken by clarity, by conviction, by action. Elijah never wanted to be legendary. He only wanted to be useful, to take pain and forge from it something permanent, a ruling, a reform, a reason for the next kid to believe the fight is worth it. And in that, he succeeded. Because the law had changed. Because schools had changed. Because a generation now walked into classrooms, courthouses and council chambers not asking for justice, but demanding it. And because of Elijah Carter, they no longer had to ask if they were allowed to speak. They knew they were. Because he already had.